Hi everyone, we are thinking on the second video now about what is sin, and this week we are thinking about Psalm 14, that sin affects everyone. It's a universal problem, and not everyone thinks that way. So the humanists, for example, I don't know if you come across the humanists or what they say about themselves before, but one of the things that they say is that we can live ethical and fulfilling lives on the basis of reason and humanity. So we can basically live good lives without God. There's nothing really wrong with this. We can decide for ourselves what is good and right. We don't need God to tell us. All that sounds very well until you look back at the thousands of years of human history and realise actually that it's been full of war, conflict and so on. We haven't really done a very good job at sorting it all out for ourselves. But to be honest, I think although most people wouldn't necessarily go with the humanist attitude, I think the idea of us being sinners is not a very common or popular one. When I go around and visit people, I go around and chat to people sometimes, and they're asking about christening, baptism or whatever, and I sort of sometimes ask the question, well, have you ever thought about yourself as a sinner? And most people say, oh, not really. And I think most people don't have the idea of themselves as a sinner. I think even for Christians, we might look around at other people and think, hey, actually, they look pretty good. They look pretty good. I have difficulty believing that they're a sinner in any particularly bad way. And that's why I think it's important to think about Psalm 14, because this really helps us to get to the heart of the matter, Psalm 14. And because Psalm 14 is a bit shorter, I'm just going to read it out for us. Psalm 14. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away, all have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never called on the Lord. But there they are, overwhelmed with dread. For God is present in the company of the righteous. You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel will come out of Zion. When the Lord restores his people, let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. And that's Psalm 14. So, like we did last time, I'm not going to go through the whole the whole of the psalm. I'm just going to pick out a few points about what this tells us about sin. And there's 5 things that I want to say here. So this is number 1. The first thing is that sin is a rejection of God, just like we saw last week. So it begins, for example, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, I think we sometimes have a view of this, particularly in this day and age. We perhaps immediately think of someone like Richard Dawkins, or one of the kind of celebrity atheists who very publicly say there is no God. We might have that as the image in our mind when we hear that. But actually, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, if you look at the word here, the fool is Nabal, and actually there was a story about a man called Nabal in the book of 1 Samuel and chapter 25, a man called Nabal. And it says, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. So, without going further into that story, you can read the rest of it in 1 Samuel 25 if you like. But the idea is that Nabal, he was a wealthy and successful man. And Nabal, in the story, I think is meant to be a fool. The play on words in terms of the name is meant to be there. We're meant to read that into the story. But he was a wealthy and successful man. He didn't look necessarily like a fool in kind of worldly terms. And he may well have been religious. He may have gone up to the temple. I don't know. But the way that he lived was not right. The way that he lived was not right. He may have been outwardly religious, but inside his heart was not right towards God. And that's what we see sort of in the rest of it. Verse 2, the Lord looks down to see if there are any who seek God. Now they've all turned away. They never call on the Lord. And really that is what being a fool is. It's about living life without reference to God, without seeking him, without really living as if he's there at all, as if he has any call on our lives, as if there is any need for us to have a relationship with him. That is what being foolish means. Just think about this. The first commandment that God gives us is to have no other gods before him. The second commandment is to not make any idols. And these are the first two commandments, and yet they're not really visible. We can't really know someone's heart. You can't really know whether someone loves the Lord with all their heart, soul, mind and strength. But you can see it in their actions. Everything else sort of flows from that. Now, if someone really loves the Lord, it will affect the rest of their actions. But it's one which is it's an invisible thing, if you like. You can't tell the state of someone's heart. But the thing is that all of the other commandments are flow from those two, to love God with everything, basically. In Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. And that's the thing, it's impossible to be a good person, if you like, someone who pleases God, who does what is right, without loving God, without relating to him, without praying to him, walking with him every day, all of those kind of things. And that's the thing which is unseen, and yet that is the thing which is most important to God. It kind of turns our priorities over. We often think that what makes someone good or not is the way they treat other people. But actually the way God sees that is, yes, that's important, but actually how we treat him, how we love him, is the first primary important thing. So the first thing is sin rejects God. The second thing is that sin corrupts us. And we see that in verse 2. The Lord looks down from heaven to see if there are any who understand. And it says, all have turned away, all have become corrupt. There's no one who does good, not even one. The image is kind of like milk turning sour, turning corrupt. It was good, but it's gone off. I don't know if anyone has ever made you a cup of tea with milk that's off. I like tea. I drink tea quite a lot, but you can tell straight away if someone's made you a cup of tea with milk that's off, or whatever your choice drink is, maybe coffee or whatever. You would know straight away. And that's the thing, that milk that's off is not fit for purpose anymore. It's still milk, but it's just not fit for purpose. And it's kind of the same with being corrupt. That sin doesn't kind of stop us being made in the image of God, doesn't stop us being human, but it just corrupts us so that we don't do good anymore. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're all just as bad as can be and we're all just murdering and pillaging and raping and whatever? It doesn't mean that, but it means that true goodness is doing something sort of purely. Goodness is doing something without thinking of yourself, but just out of love for God, out of love for the other person, and so on. Just kind of having a right view of ourselves. That is what true goodness is. And that's why when there was a young man who came to Jesus and he said, good teacher, and Jesus turns back on him and says, why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. No one is good except God alone. They're saying, look, all of us fall short of goodness. There is goodness in us, but we fall short of that kind of purity of goodness which God requires. We don't ever do a single good deed, something which God would look on and say, there is a pure good deed. And that's because we've been corrupted in everything, that actually every time we do something good, there is an element of selfishness or sin inside it. Think of the best thing that you've ever done. Maybe you gave some money to charity, gave a large sum to charity, or maybe you did something really good for someone else. I don't know. But think of even the best thing that you did and think, surely there was an element in that of thinking about yourself. You didn't just do it for the goodness of it. But if you look at your motives, you did it perhaps because you wanted other people to see how good you were, or maybe you wanted a cleaner conscience. You wanted to have a cleaner conscience and think, oh yes, I'm a good person, and so on. If we really look at even our best deeds, they're not really truly good. And that's what this is getting at here in Psalm 14. That's why at the time of the Reformation, in one of the confessions in the Anglican, the Church of England prayer book, it says there is no health in us. And that's because actually when, not that we're all as bad as can be, but there's no part of us that God can look at and say, ah yes, that is healthy, I can account you righteous because of that. That we needed a sort of complete forgiveness and complete transformation. We couldn't just earn part of the way up to God and then God would do the rest, but that we needed complete forgiveness in every part. And that is the wonder of it. But we'll come on to that. So that's point 2, that we don't do good deeds, we're corrupt. Third thing is that this is a universal problem, that everyone sins. And look at the language that he uses. He says, there is no one who does good. The Lord looks down on heaven on all mankind. There is no one who does good, not even one. Sin is a universal problem, not a local problem. It doesn't just affect a few specific people, perhaps the people in jail or murderers or something, but it's universal. And we're all equally sinners, and we all need a saviour. That's just what it means to be human. To be a sinner is part really of what it means to live at the moment. No, we only think that we're good enough, that we're not sinners, because we compare ourselves with other people. I look at my neighbour down the road and I think, oh well, I'm not as bad as him or her, therefore I'm a pretty good person. But actually, if we compare ourselves with the way that we should be, and the way that we should be, we see that in Jesus. When we compare ourselves with him, then our own efforts kind of pale into comparison, and we see actually we don't really do good, because Jesus did pure good, and we nowhere near those standards. I think when we compare ourselves with the way that we should be, I think it exposes the fact that everyone is a sinner. Fourth thing, sin devours God's people. And this is what it says it goes on to in the second half of the psalm. It talks about these evildoers, they devour my people as though eating bread. And it says, you evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor. Eating bread, of course, just an everyday common thing in those days and still today. Bread is just a staple part of the diet in many countries, and certainly in the UK. I think I have bread pretty much every day. And it just means it's sort of like devouring the people of God, being against them. It's just kind of like such an everyday common thing. It's just a regular common thing. I think it just explains so much, though. It explains why the world is so hostile to Christians. If you look around the world, if you go on to Open Doors, or the Barnabas Fund, there's sort of 2 charities who work with persecuted Christians, you see that Christians are probably the most, in fact, I think statistically Christians are the most persecuted group of people on the planet. Everyone hates Christians, it seems. And you think that's not a surprise given what we read in Psalm 14, is it? And the reason is, and as we read in John chapter 3, is ultimately because people don't want their consciences pricked. They don't want anything to be exposed. This is what it says in John chapter 3, verses 19 to 21. This is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light, because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light, and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. And Jesus said, John chapter 7 verse 7, the world hates me because I testify that its works are evil. So that's the thing, that the world doesn't do what is right. It does what is evil. It doesn't. The good deeds that the world does don't come up to the standard that God requires, even the good deeds. And people don't want to be exposed. They rather just say, oh, I'm fine without God. I'm perfectly fine on my own. I'm a good person. I don't want to be exposed for what I am. And that's why they hate Christians, because they don't want to be exposed for who they really are. And this is what we read throughout the Bible. It's not a surprise what is happening to Christians around the world, because people realise that it is the truth, and yet they don't want to come to the truth. They'd rather do anything, rather get rid of the Christians than actually face the truth. People don't want to hear it. People don't want to hear that they're sinners. And this is really where it comes back to, where we come back to the beginning, that actually, sin is a universal problem, but people don't want to hear that problem. And that's why I wanted to do this series and thinking about what sin is, because I think we really need to grapple and understand with what sin is in order to understand the gospel. Now, we can't understand the good news unless we first understand what sin is. Now, when we've begun to understand what sin is, then we can begin to understand what Jesus has done for us. And the more we understand of what sin is, the more we'll understand of what Jesus has done for us. And the wonderful good news, and this is the last thing that I wanted to finish with, is that God is present with his people. That God, as it says, God is present in the company of the righteous. That actually a Christian is not someone who doesn't sin anymore, but a Christian is someone rather who owns up to the truth, who puts their hand up and say, it's a fair cop, you got me, I am a sinner, please God, will you forgive me? And that is the path to knowing God. In 1 John chapter 1 verses 8 and 9 it says, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just, will forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And that's the thing, that a Christian is someone who doesn't claim to be without sin, but who acknowledges their sin, acknowledges the sinfulness in their own hearts, and comes to God and says, God, I need you to help me. I need you to forgive me. And please will you do that and help me to live a more righteous life today and tomorrow and every day. And coming to God every day in that sort of confession and faith. And that is the path to real spiritual life and maturity and growth in the Christian faith. So I hope that you found this video helpful. Please do click the thumbs up, the like button down below if you enjoyed it. And next week's video we'll be thinking about idolatry from Jeremiah chapter 2, and we'll sort of be probing into that to understand more about what sin is. If you'd like to see that video, then you can hit the subscribe button down below, and if you click on the notification bell, once you click that button, then you'll get notified. You'll get an email and get a notification when I upload a new video. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do appreciate it. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again for another video very soon. God bless.